One introduction. Thank you. Okay, hey everyone, welcome to the ESL final of Euros 2018. Congratulations to all the teams again on this really momentous achievement. My name is Tina, I'll be your chairman, for pronoun is she. Judging with me from left to right will be...
Brian, prefer Jenny for language. Matt, for your name.
Maldash, your name.
Rafi, your name.
Clyde, Pete.
Income, no preference.
If the teams would now like to share their pronouns, they can do so. So, OG.
Michael, no preference. Van, no preference.
OO.
Lover, Tin first, lover second, here they vote.
CG.
Amichai first, Tido second, no preference.
And CO.
Romance speaking first, your name please.
Second, your name is fine.
Fantastic. This debate will be recorded. Speakers are reminded that if you would like to retroactively not consent and have your speech deleted, you can do so immediately after the final takes place. So with that, we welcome the Prime Minister. You're here.
Can you hear me? Is it going well? Sorry. Panel, this motion isn't a perfect solution to forever ever prevent post-conflict communities from conflict or discrimination of minorities of the side which is lost. We say that it's comparatively better than an alternative which leaves too much of a leeway for interpretation of those events with impunity and can lead to increased hatred. What is our model? As an example, we would like to take Germany. Three things in here. Firstly, media. We believe that through media, government can portray the majority, the people who have perpetrated those acts of violence as horrible. History education also should be changed, also should be altered to reflect those things. Secondly, holidays. We would like to commemorate, maybe it's not the best word, but basically acknowledge the misdemeanors that we've done. History stands separately to that. We say that in a contexts we're talking about, such as Rwanda, such as Hatin and USSR, should presumably tell sorry, Rohingya Muslims and Myanmar government. Okay, the trade-off we are ready to accept in this debate that some people were not responsible for those kinds of crime and we assign blame to them, and some people will feel resentment to that. A couple of responses to this. Firstly, we believe that in such a context, states have a lot of power to shape the narrative, and that is to say, to create a perception among people that it is natural, that it is organic, given the immense amount of power, given the whole budget that the state can dedicate to promote this particular narrative through media, through educational sources, and other means. Which brings me to my first clash, presumably, in this debate: is it legit? Firstly, we say that not only people who participated in actively massacring certain minorities are also guilty. Why? Firstly, you could have been a bystander and you allowed those things to happen. Yes, you could be hopeless, you could be powerless at that moment, but we say that still you've presumably benefited if majority has exploited minority to such an extent. But secondly, we say that governments prescribe certain identities to people that they haven't chosen all the time, and for example, the very fact that you've been born into this national state and you take up all the heritage, all the historical background of that state is also illegitimate, so we say it's simply a let's say, extension of this principle of prescription of identities. No, thank you. But more importantly, look why this policy is effective. Before 2014, Russian Federation and people from Ukraine approached one another as like Bratya Slavenia, Russians and Ukrainians, Bratya Navyek. It has immediately changed within 1 year, and now our people, at least in Russia, like we hate people in general, like in Ukraine. We say this is the demonstration of state power which can actually happen and why it can be effective. So the second question in this debate, is it going to be effective to prevent future crimes? Before that, closing.
So if my brother commits a crime, should I be either jailed or shamed for my brother committing that crime?
Okay. The process of initial reconciliation and bringing justice, we say, will vary, and not necessarily, it's not necessarily the scope of this motion. That is to say, a nation state can start building new identity and can start building the narratives about the war only after the process of reconciliation. So we say before that point, it's up to them to make like truth and reconciliation or criminal justice. Okay, why minorities are less likely to suffer and outside of the house and these crimes are less likely to appear again? Note that very often the contexts we're talking about have room for interpretation, even genocides, genocides and population transfers and so on. Why? Because very often they had happened either in the context of a civil war, or B, governments were able to manufacture the context and pretext for those retaliatory actions. For example, Rohingya Muslims who were officially attacked back only after certain security patrols were attacked by themselves. We say that in such a context, it's always easy for certain groups to hijack the narrative and say that actually it wasn't that much of a problem. A good demonstration of this, and I hope it's a true fact, that 49% of people in Serbia do not believe that massacre really was Srebrenica was a real massacre. What do they say instead? They do not deny it wholesale, but they say that it was a legitimate counterattack. It was done in the context of a civil war. All sides are to blame. We say that in such a context, it's always easy to deny your own blame, and there is always an incentive because people internally do not want to feel bad about themselves. You always want to enjoy impunity for those actions. So we say that when there is less of a guilt for you, you are less likely to, for example, listen more carefully to people who are talking about that. Yes, to some extent it can affect the immediate process of reconciliation and bargaining on how to shape the state, how to shape all the institutions, whether or not to promote inclusion or not to promote inclusion. Look, we agree that certain people will stand by deep nationalistic narrative and deny blame all the time. We say that these people are beyond the reach of this motion. Who are in the reach are people in between, people who are undecided, people who reasonably want to be on the bright side of history. We say that it's the vast majority of the electorate very often. So what do we say in regards to those people? Firstly, they are less likely to believe in conspiracy theories which assign blame to the minorities themselves or which claim that it wasn't crime to begin with. They are less likely to dispute victims' claims and other result in visit upon them emotional harm. They are less likely to vote against their interest by, for example, banning their surnames in the region, by not providing sufficient funding to religious and cultural institutions. They are less likely to neglect their rights. On individual level, you are less likely to discriminate against a person, as a teacher or as an employer, of an identity of that person. Why? Because guilt is incompatible within human psyche with the presumption of innocence and with inherent evilness towards that person. Why is that the case? Because if you believe that you are guilty for the problems of that person, you are less likely to interpret it in other ways. That is to say, it's their blame, they're too lazy, or they're simply they're stupid or they're lazy, etc. For example, look at how successfully Germany has done that. We say that even if they go beyond the actual harms, that is to say, if they overcompensate to the wrongs they did, it's fine because minorities have suffered quite a lot. In the long term, look, victims becoming older and older. Infrastructure is rebuilt and you no longer see artillery strikes. There is a news cycle is full of other narratives, and it becomes easier for politicians who have an incentive to find easy solutions, to blame, to scapegoat minorities, to start it again. We say it's more likely to be prevented on our side, and therefore both sporadic violence and systematic discrimination, which could lead to potentially the same things, is less likely to happen on our side of the house as well. Incredibly proud to propose.
I thank that speaker very, very much for a fine speech. Welcome the leader of the opposition.
On opening opposition, we would like a world where everybody is a hero. We just do not believe we can expect everyone to be. Before we explain both the principal argument and the practical impacts, let's just do with opening government explain why they're out of this debate. we do not see why on our side we still cannot educate people that crimes against humanity are something we should never commit. We are still very welcome to educate people through history classes in school that genocide and human crimes we committed have horribly disadvantaged us. For example, in Germany, our country was split in two because we fucked up during the Holocaust. We say that is enough to convince people we should never do things like that again. We also say we can glorify heroes who stood up against the regime. We can glorify their resistance. We can point to them as an example that we should follow. We can still have truth and reconciliation committees. We can still have legal processes which are very easily going to point to where the blame lies and where it doesn't. Given OG claims the media and schooling are very efficient at providing narratives and disseminating them, we say what we tell you as an alternative is equally efficient by their own metric. They never provided you proof why, within a certain identity, we should blame every single person, not just the people alive during that conflict, but also the people who come afterwards. Just shortly on the point of interpretations. We say even if you convince the people of Serbia that Srebrenica was a genocide, we say that when people vote in parties that are far right and have genocidal policies, when people support things which can lead to crimes against humanity, they do not believe they are doing so. They ideologically outframe that idea. Your example proves this. The Serbs believe Srebrenica was not a genocide. Of course they believe genocide was bad. Ask someone on the street who like genocide, proper answer no. But they still claim Srebrenica does not fit the definition because they ideologically outframed it out of that definition. That still happens on their side. Let's give you our case, the principle. What does collective guilt mean? It means that even though you were already brave enough not to cooperate with the regime, not to hold a gun to somebody else's head, although a gun was held to your head, you still did not. What government wants to do is tell us that people who did not cooperate with the regime but simply did not resist it are guilty. We say that is horribly wrong to do. Because let us explain what is the calculus of these people. On one hand, you have a regime which is obviously genocidal, most of the times authoritarian and dictatorial, and persecutes people who do not stand with that regime. This means the calculus is, if you openly resist, if you demonstrate against the regime, or vote for a party that opposes it, it is very likely you will be pursued, or worst case scenario, killed. The people who are your friends and your family, very likely also. The people you believe you have a responsibility towards. This means your life and the life of the people you love is in danger. On the other hand, a factually true calculus, given the strength of the regime and given most people are disincentivized to demonstrate against it, for the reasons I just explained, even if I were to refuse to be a clerk in Auschwitz, the machine would still run. Even if I were to refuse that order, the machine would still run. People would still get killed. I don't get to save a life if I resist, but I get to save lives if I don't. I save my life, I save the life of those I love. It's a factually true calculus, and it's an instinctively and intuitively true calculus. We say they can never explain to you why we should expect from people to be heroes. We say it would be nice if they were, but given this situation, they cannot be. They have actually reduced or completely removed agency. In those situations, we do not expect people to risk themselves. Is the classic burning bus example right? When you get your driver's license, you are told, if you see a burning car on the highway, you do not stop and help those people, because you are faced with overwhelming odds. You are most likely to die yourself, and most likely to help no one. If a school shooter enters a school building, we consider it extremely imprudent for you to try to stop the school shooter, because he's got a fucking gun, and you've got your bare hands. Most likely, more people end up dead in that situation. That is what they are standing for on their side. But it's even more traumatic, given that their case has to stand for traumatizing and blaming people who were not even alive in that situation. They did not have the agency to choose whether or not they are bystanders, because they were not even born. They did not choose when they were born. Most likely, they're already fucked up, because countries that committed crimes against humanity tend to be sanctioned, tend to be ideologically tainted and often ostracized from diplomatic relations. They tend to have traumatic histories, such as Germany being split up in two. They tend to have memories of family members being lost in that conflict. Like, telling them that they are guilty for something that happened when they were not alive is even worse. Telling people that they are potentially guilty, or their family who they identified with is guilty for the fact that they potentially lost someone who they love, is extremely traumatic in a situation where they already lost so much. We say never in this world can the side government principally justify this policy, nor can they prove it is sufficient, given what we're moving on to now. We say these countries were already extremely punished in terms of foreign policy relations, in terms of sanctions levied on them, in terms of the fact they are acutely aware that a huge portion of the world believes they are genocidal and flawed. What we do is punish them further, and we cause the situation to get worse. This is the direct response to OG. on the idea of people believing conspiracy theories and being likely to go for conflict if we do not implement this policy. First of all, they say guilt is tantamount to evil. When you are told that you are evil, this very easily transforms into anger. This very easily transforms into the idea that I am now blamed for something I was never guilty of committing. This very easily transforms to like anger against the government that teaches me this, to anger against the international institutions that support my government. This very easily transforms into people voting for far-right parties who opt against this narrative that we are not guilty, that we were the greater ones, that we now have the right to take revenge onto those people who blamed us. This makes it more likely for conflict to happen. Before I move on to explain it even further, I'll take closer.
Yeah, can you point out who those groups in Germany who fought against the Nazis, how big they were, and how likely is the narrative to succeed in convincing people?
First of all, we said that there are certain groups who fought against the Nazis, like the Kaiser Kreis, which existed in Germany. Second of all, we say you did not have to fight against the Nazis for you to be brave enough to resist them, to not cooperate with the Nazis, which is enough. Thirdly, you should have listened to the beginning of my speech where I explained by OG's magic how alternative is efficient enough. Moving on, we say this does not only apply to wars between countries, this applies to ethnic tensions as well. So within Rwanda, if you tell the Hutus that they are structurally responsible for what they did against the Tutsis, what is very likely to happen is that within institutions, within opportunity structures in a certain country, you are going to have institutionalized discrimination of a certain group, because both groups within the country internalize that a certain group is guilty and probably should be disprivileged because we do not have the right to give them a position of power again. This is likely to lead to more tensions when that group revolts against the fact that they are now disprivileged. This is why the genocide happened. The Hutus were disprivileged by the Belgians because the Belgians gave all the power to the Tutsis. They are literally repeating that mechanism. We also say countries are far easier to ostracize when the international community believes they're deeply genocidal. There's a far stronger narrative which you can claim to ostracize these countries, grant them less diplomatic deals, and punish them even further after the horrors that happen. In no world can anybody but opening opposition win this debate.
Can you hear me well? Okay, good. Dear panel, there were 1 million people shot in the USSR. There were dozens of millions who were sent to gulags and they perished there. The problem is everyone blamed Stalin, but no one blamed 60 anonymous reports upon which these people were persecuted. Who were these people? Basically, open opposition says in totalitarian system you do not have agency to such extent that we never ever can blame you for committing and participating in the acts of these atrocities. We are saying in all circumstances you do have agency, but even if you do not have agency to the extent that they would like to have, we are saying you are still complicit in the act upon outcome. We are not saying you should be a hero all the time, but we are saying you shouldn't be villain. Unfortunately, all acts of massive atrocities, they happened in the context when you needed massive mobilization of people, and in this regard, you, upon your collective identity of a nation or country, you're blamed for this. I'll bring mostly principal case in my speech. It will be my first point, and second of all, lots of practical outcomes. Before, just 2 points of extraneous reputation. So, they're offered alternatives. Let's be just general in terms of genocide happened, and it is a bad thing.
I mean, you need to be very specific who committed this genocide. Let's compare two systems. Japan, that didn't pass the system of denazification, that right now considers as most citizens that they didn't really colonize Korea, they didn't rape women in China. Or Germany, when this feature was prioritized in curricula, like you were participating in massive acts of atrocities. Let's imagine that in Germany it would be told, yes, we killed lots of Jews, it's bad, not do this. I mean, it's not the thing that we would like to have. We would like to have a massive, curricula that will be very specific and blame all people who participated in this collectively. Second of all, they're saying, no, we would like to point out the heroes, and these heroes will inspire everyone. First of all, just mutually exclusive. Why? Just because if you have heroes, then you create the perception, he's for my identity, therefore my own nation was against genocide. It was very few bad people like Stalin, Hitler, who committed this genocide. Therefore, your system of inspiration through heroes basically undermines an opportunity to look to all massive cases of persecution. And let's pay attention. Most people, they weren't persecuted. In most cases, leadership was persecuted. But in order to enact actions of leadership, you needed participation of people at the ground. Low-scale bureaucracy. People at the village who were at the charge of these villages, and then they were given Jews during the Second World War to Nazis. None of them, most of them weren't really in jail. We are saying in this case, we would prioritize system of a massive responsibility. Principal case. So let's 4 things here. Basically, you indeed never ever consented to be born in a certain circumstances, and you never ever consented to certain type of identity. The fact of absence of consent doesn't mean you do not have any duty whatsoever, either towards your identity or towards people with whom you interact. What does it mean? It means 4 things. Number 1. If you have sense of identity that is based that I'm German, I'm a citizen of the USSR, you extract lots of benefits from the fact of a feeling of belonging to the community, from the fact that you belong to the large empire. Feel the fact that Germany is expanding in their next Austria, and most people were celebrating and quite happy about this. The problem is, they're going to cherry pick and then say, my whole identity was that pure, that white, that I will always feel only good things about that. Insofar, your identity has been shaped also not only about good things, but also about atrocious things. You principally have an obligation to those people upon which your nation capitalized. The society became great through massive scale of atrocities of a conquering people. You could get this pleasure of being the citizen of the USSR, feeling that you're the greatest almighty power in the world only through this conquering. Therefore, you have reciprocal duty to those who perished through the feeling of a guilt that crimes that was committed upon this collective identity. Second, they say, no, if you're bystander, we shouldn't blame you, never. Problem. If you're bystander, you could indeed to some extent interfere, and then afterwards, even if it will be a small effect, it will be still opportunity to justify you. The problem in most regimes, it never ever happens, or really rarely. For instance, the comparison. In the USSR, it was one woman who went to the Red Square after the USSR started oppressing the protesters in Czechoslovakia. She showed the sign, it's wrong, you shouldn't do this, blame on the USSR. She was the only one, none other did. Meaning the entire nation was these bystanders who benefited from the idea that it's fine to oppress other peoples, insofar we are promoting the idea of communism and having this collective identity. The thing is, in all circumstances, you can sacrifice yourself if necessary, but the problem on their side of the house, in most cases, people are timid, coward, they do not want to do this. They say you should be hero, we are saying no, you shouldn't be a villain, because you become a villain at the moment when you do nothing, and you're more likely these things will happen. No. Third of all, beneficiary. Let's understand, you're quite often beneficiary of immediate circumstances, just quite practically. If it's the USA, the USA, and in the South, African Americans are enslaved and oppressed. What happens? Basically, you're privileged, less competition on the market. Second of all, you get cheap labor. You're a direct beneficiary, but the problem, it happens in the long term. If there is no feeling, if there is no opportunity to create this consciousness that will impose on you that you are responsible for all this history of oppression that has been passed through generations in response to the open air position that it shouldn't work historically. Even if I didn't participate at all, wasn't born even in these circumstances, I'm still beneficiary of this system. Lastly, on agencies. They said you do not have any agency. They said in all circumstances people have their mind. They have basic moral intuition. They have even limited access to information, meaning you always can make good act. Therefore, in all circumstances, you have limited agency. Practical. Basically, they're saying people do not people. It will backlash. People do not like to feel that they're guilty. First of all, it's not comparative. On their side of the house, most of them will feel that they will be justified, their nation was superb, great, and they're more likely, therefore, either to support authoritarian regimes like in Russia, who never ever owed to the idea that the totalitarian regime is terrible, to offend these minorities, saying no, these minorities weren't actually persecuted by anyone, or they were persecuted by some third actors and they're not responsible for. But we are saying that we are working with children, if we are talking about historical curriculum, they're quite tabula rasa. It's quite easy to point out to their basic moral intuition and shake this feeling of collective guilt, and therefore to prevent further atrocities, because they understand it's a morally wrong, absolutely, and you owe to this identity. For all these reasons, proud to propose.
Very much, and welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
It comes as a surprise that most likely I'll be the more polite part of our team today. This is really a surprise to me. So first, what I want to talk about is the last point that came out of opening government in terms of that they are the beneficiaries, the people are the beneficiaries of these policies. We say that's hugely regime mischaracterization. Secondly, I want to talk about why effectiveness is on our side of the house, why the future functioning of the state is currently this. And lastly, I want to remind you that the principle we brought to you was barely touched by the opening government. This is the most important part of our case. First, on this idea that Serbs, Germans, Japanese, Rwandans, Croatians are beneficiaries of the fact that they have committed human crimes against humanity in the past is simply wrong. Like, their countries was destroyed, their international reputation was destroyed, some of the countries were even bombed, for example, in the example of Serbia. They are not looked better now because of the crimes against humanity that past generations have done. This is a bad mischaracterization of this debate. But moreover, in terms of rebuttal, the very fact that Stalin and all of these other people that they had people at the bottom, this only means that there were other people but Stalin to blame. This does not mean that every single family in Russia ought to bear this blame. There is something we specifically show in our example, why it's principally unjust. Or even the majority of people were actually complicit in this, which we say is not the case with the majority of crimes against humanity. It might be the case, it's only the case basically with Germany, maybe, if you want to claim that. But in Belgrade, for example, the rate at which people were mobilized was 2%. You still blame these people for crimes that Serbs have committed somewhere else. We say that's wrong and you shouldn't do that. But let's engage with the effectiveness clash. And both of the opening government and closing government in this debate basically say, yeah, Germany went well. We say there's a number of reasons why Germany is off clash. It's a unique example. Their structural situations in other countries are different. The first one is they had the Allied occupation for a couple of years after the war, which means you have complete control over the narrative you create. This does not happen in other societies because you still have parties who believe that you should have been probably more hard in the war, more harsh, committed more crimes maybe. At least these are the people who would not give you, you would not have the total space. Also, the economic miracle that happened in Germany was because the United States, pumped a lot of money there. We say that comparatively, you don't get that in Rwanda, you didn't get that in Serbia, you're not going to get that anywhere else. Also, this was probably the biggest crime against humanity, which means that it's disproportional their side of the house to claim that people are going to react the same way in sort of like some lesser crimes that happen in other wars. But lastly, this was probably also the most authoritarian regime in a big country recently, which means that people actually were more capable of, receiving this other idea because they were so oppressed under the regime. I mean, some of the people that lived under regimes that committed crimes against humanity were okay, they lived a good life, which means that in these cases, these people will not have the same capacity to actually respond to the narrative that this was bad. This answers to their mechanism, it's not effective. Structurally, you don't get these conditions in other countries. They are, there's a lot of poverty there because of the war. There's a lot of refugees there. There's PTSD. There's people who can't work because they were destroyed in the war. We say that the situation is much more dire than they portrayed it in their single example of Germany. But let's talk about the future functioning of the state. And this is really important here because here we engage with their case of Germany. We say that Germany right now is suffering because of this narrative. We say that German foreign policy, we say that German economic policy, we say that German military policy is completely incapable in protecting the interests of Germans who live today in the state. But it also harms other people in the region. It also harms people who are dependent on Germany acting in a way in which it necessarily can't act. There's a number of reasons for this. The first one is that you're necessarily too careful. If this narrative sinks in with people, you're always too careful in terms of acting with other actors, that you are not perceived as someone who is likely to commit these crimes again and stuff like that. Secondly, we say that it's out of time because you're constantly reminded about this idea, which means that you are likely to compare the situation in the status quo to the situation which happened before, which means that that's problematic because it's likely that the situation has changed and that you have to act in a different way. At the end of the day, we want to act in a different way. We don't want you to commit crimes against humanity again. And lastly, this means that that these people are burdened internally, which means that when you are Angela Merkel, even though if you don't have these things from other countries, who still see Germany as someone who is to blame, that means that when your internal calculus happens, you are not clear in this decision-making process. Why is this important? We recognize that Japan is on our side of the house because they literally had the constitutional limit on having an army up until some point because of that collective blame that was installed in the people. So we say that Germany and Japan, and the more important example here is probably Japan. Because why? We say that Japan is under a credible threat by China right now. That Japan has the right to exercise its self-defense against the potential Chinese threat. If the collective guilt that happened in the past actually disables Japan from investing in military, as it has happened in the status quo, in pursuing a much aggressive foreign policy that it needs to do now to counteract China, we say that you are repeating the past mistakes of the past. Because if Japan is not able to protect its people, that means that the Japanese people are more prone to be victims of crimes against humanities because they committed crimes against humanities before. We say this only can fit under their side of the house if they are for retribution, if that's their way of dealing with crimes against humanity. I will take closing.
Yeah, who do you think suffered more during the Second World War? The innocent Germans or the Jews who were massacred?
There's no debate here. But what we are, the Jews suffered more. But the problem is that German people also suffered. Literally, because of what happened. We say that German people also had the suffering. This is when the principal point that we have here is important. Because we say that a lot of these people did not have the agency to act. Even if we engage with the most important point here, and that's when you were not passive, when you were not just caring about your life. If you were the villain, oftentimes these people were forced to be soldiers. They were drugged. They had this narrative that the propaganda installed in their eyes. They were told that worse stuff were done to their people, which made them have no agency, which made them back on the symmetry, on the wrong information. We say even in this case we engage with their idea that these people, because they did something, because they did some bad stuff, they should face the punishment. Because in this debate we prove that principally you cannot blame all of the people because all of the people are not responsible. But because we also show you practical impacts in Tim's speech about reconciliation, in my speech about future policy, we think we have a strong case in terms of winning this debate. If you can do the hands. guys think now? Like, I would just like to thank everyone who helped us, and you know, like, you guys are awesome.
We thank that speaker very much and welcome the member of government.
Top half decided that this debate is about the winning side of massacre and whether they should feel a bit bad on themselves or not. We are going to talk about two things. The people who actually got hurt in those massacres and where is the bigger chance that we actually give them back and try to make their life better. Secondly, what is where the chance of another massacre to happen will be a lot lower, spoiler, on our side. Those would be my 2 points, but first of all, a quick point of rebuttal. Well, Germany feels so bad about the Holocaust that now it acts differently internationally. Of course, it tries a lot more to prevent other massacres happening around the world. This is a good thing. That alone is a great thing on our side. And that China is Japan is afraid to make his own army, so they are unprotected. First of all, the US protected. And secondly, if they had an army, China would be so scared that the chance of a real war between China and Japan would be a lot bigger. So that, again, is a good acting of those kind of countries. But let's go to my points. First of all, look, the people who, a lot of the time, the people who suffer from the massacre, the people who survive are suffering a lot of the years after that. We're talking about the Jews who ran away from Germany to Israel and other countries, and they were poor, they didn't have any families, they had PTSD, some of them were actually physically hurt, and their life was ruined to years. So we're talking about Bohemia, who are still in other countries, out of Myanmar, and have nothing for themselves. And we think that once after the massacre, a couple of years after that, when you need to actually, when there's time to ask back some help, aid or money or a passport or anything to help them to gain their life back, the ability to convince the people of the country to actually give this money is a lot harder when they don't feel personally responsible to what happened, because they always have their poor, they always have their problems, they always have their diseases, and if I need to decide whether my dollar is going to go to people that persons that suffered because of my country years ago, or to the people I see now, it's a lot harder unless I feel personally responsible to what happened there, and that is why the ability to save those people's life is a lot harder. This is why in Israel, even the second generation of people who are still afraid that someone is knocking on the door in the middle of the night can actually get still help from the Germans just because they are still feel personally responsible for that. They are the most miserable people in this debate. They are the people who needs the most, the country the most. Then even if the winning country suffer a little bit, it just doesn't really that important. Secondly, we think that a lot of the time the people who got hurt are in another country at all. We're talking about the countries in Yugoslavia, we're talking about Sudan, we're talking about Congo and the fight there because of Rwandan people. If one side doesn't feel responsible, doesn't show that they take responsibility for what happened, it was their fault, okay, the fight keeps on between those different countries. We can see that one side says, you have to bring me money, you owe me, that was your fault, and the other side just stigmatizing for lying, for picking on him. It means that a lot of countries are still at war just because the side who did the massacre doesn't show or doesn't feel responsible. That is why the only way to stop it is actually taking responsibility. Before I go to the next point. Second.
So, how does your comparative specifically work here? Because why can't you not simply aid people at the moment that they're really, really poor? Why do you need to feel emotionally
Because you have poor people at your own country. Because Germans still have problems, and the only way for them to open their their heart and decide to give it to other people, if only if they feel that it was their fault and they are still responsible for that, and that is why they owe the money to other people and not to the poor people in Africa right now that they are still poor, or in their own country. We think that is the only way. Okay. Secondly, let's talk about the next massacre, because we hear some brilliant case. Look, a lot of people couldn't stop the Nazis because, or couldn't stop the war because what could one person do, or because they were so powerful. The problem is that this is not the stage when you're supposed to stop the next revolution, okay? Because when Germans teach about World War II, they're not starting with where there's death camps. They're starting that there was a political parties, there was riots, there was ideas in our country that over the years, because the silent majority didn't go outside, because the silent majority didn't pass rules, they took those ideas out of the political sphere. That is why years after that, they become an army, and they had the power to actually do the massacre, to actually hurt the people. Only when you teach people that even if you personally would never do it, even if it's not you, it's other political parties, you have the power, your father or grandfather had the power to stop it, and then you today need to stop it. Why? First of all, why is that important? First of all, it answers a lot of the responsibility case we heard from top half, even though it's all important. Secondly, it actually prevent the next one. Why? Because you can see now you have the political capital. When people really understand how can you change, stop the next one, when people feel they have the obligation to go and vote for a party that actually prevent printing books like Mein Kampf, that actually promote ideas that in the end makes the political power to actually do those massacres, to actually stop and take out of the law political parties with nationalistic, extreme nationalistic ideas, because it makes the country a lot harder on any kind of riot or a group that goes against minorities in the country. That is the way to stop the next one while it's small, when you understand why, when you understand it's your obligation to do it first.
We gave you explanation how anger easily could be healed, how guilt easily transforms into anger and revanchism, while guilt is not a guarantee that you will believe you're committing war crimes when voting for such a party.
That is not a good that is, first of all, the alternative. I want to talk about why it's very hard to actually help the people the victims. Secondly, look, you need to understand that even if that is your responsibility to do it, that it was your fault, that even if you're not one of the people with the guns, you have the responsibility to do it. And that is the way that we see it being taught today in a lot of those countries. And that is the way that we support actually teaching that, showing that you have the power to do it, you have the obligation to do it, even if you are one, even if the situation is hard, even if it doesn't, you can't, it's very far away for actual massacre or thing to happen. What have we shown you? We've shown you through a battle that international cooperation is going to be good, and a lot of countries will try to stop wars. We show you why you need the collective the feel of responsibility in order to actually help the people who got hurt. And lastly, we show you how we can actually stop through rules and political action the next massacre. Please propose. Thank you very much.
About whether you should be a hero or a villain. We tell you that this debate is way more about whether you create more villains or not. That is what our case is very simply going to be about. Before I'm going to explain that, I think I want to give one point of specific refutation on the closing government case. They tell you it's great. We're going to give a lot of reparations and aid. But I think the problem that they never explain is why that aid is going to go to the people who need it most. We tell you that that emotional feeling of responsibility and feeling that you are directly responsible for one group means you're going to feel it, going to give it to the people that you feel most responsible to, rather than give it to the people who need it most. So instead of giving it to the poorest of the poor, poor, or the most urgent of the urgent, you're going to give it to the people that you feel saddest about. I think that is a burden opposition needs to take upon themselves. But also, I think that the bulk of the Gov case at this point is based on the presumption that people are going to be persuaded by this, and the vast majority of people are going to believe this, but more crucially, are not going to be alienated with this. So I think before we delve into that, I think we need to set up the counterfactual slightly more clearly. I think all already tells you there's education, but I think that they themselves do not specifically strategically impact that. How does education specifically work? I think education in the status quo could already show people that it's bad to commit war crimes, what war crimes can do, and what specific issues are with doing those horrible things. I think that means that the people who are susceptible to these kind of narratives are already in the status quo likely to be persuaded by that. That means that I think the proposition had to prove to you why an extra amount of people would be persuaded. We tell you that specifically the people who are not persuaded by this educational system are likely to be the people who are most likely to be alienated by a system of actively pushing for personal, emotional, and collective guilt. So how does this specifically work? Before we move on, okay.
So probably if it's a bad system of education and policy will fail. If it's good, it will succeed. The key question is a principal one, whether you principally own up to the crimes of your nation.
Okay, so I think A, at the moment if you are as criminally kind of responsible for things you tell them to do, I think you should sue everybody in that collective, right? I think you never explain as to why you are not responsible, or why you are responsible but shouldn't be sued for that. I think second of all, I think the educational system can be good, right? If you guys can push for this narrative, I think we can also use that same fiat to push for a more objective narrative in which we do tell that it's bad to do those things, but we don't tell that you're responsible as the collective. So how does this specifically work? What type of people are you likely to alienate? And I think that here it's crucial to understand why there's specific groups of people who won't be persuaded by this, but will feel actively alienated by this. I think it's twofold. First of all, I think there's a very big group of people who in the status quo felt that they were part only of pawn in the system. That is to say that they felt like they were under social pressure or that there were more urgent reasons as to why they did those horrible things. That is not to say that they're not morally culpable. That is to say that simply they do not feel personally guilty for the crimes that they committed. That is crucial because that means at the moment that you start actively pushing for them to feel collectively guilty for the things that they did, you actively alienate them. Because instead of telling you that objectively crimes against humanity are bad, that objectively that system was bad, you tell them that they are bad people and that they're responsible for what they did. I think secondly, that in general, the feeling of guilty is difficult to accept. I think that's broadly for two reasons. I think it basically works the following way. No, the crimes against humanity are very fair to fair. That is to say that it's often the worst of the worst that you can do. I think that's crucial in two specific ways. First of all, it means that during being a pawn in the system, you often internalize reasons as to why you're innocent. That is to say that you are telling yourself that you're not morally culpable, that you're telling yourself that it's okay what you're doing in the status quo. That means that it's very difficult to push people into actually believing that. I think it secondly means that people afterwards also try to talk themselves out of their guilt. Why is this crucial? Then, that means that we tell you it's better to tell the crimes against humanity are bad, that the system in which you had to operate was bad, rather than that you as a person are bad. So we can still tell you that Nazi Germany was a bad regime, but we cannot tell you that you as a person are responsible for upholding that system, and that you are responsible for all of the crimes that have been committed under that system. Why is that very, very important within this debate? I think that there are two burdens in the CO we can take upon ourselves. A, we're going to tell you it's a very significant group of people that will be alienated from this narrative, and therefore very angry towards people who are actively pushing them upon this narrative. Because know that the people who have to promote this narrative are likely to be politicians who are catering towards the victims of those crimes against humanity. That means that at the moment that people are alienated, they're going to be actively against those specific groups. I think this group is likely to be very big, given that most of the people were only a pawn in the system, given that most of the people feel like these responsibilities are too severe to take up on themselves. That means that I think that the group is very likely to be significant in numbers. That means that I think you get significant voting power in favor of often problematic policies and problematic narratives. That means that I do think there's a very significant impact within this debate. But I was so determined that I should also learn how to take the smaller impact, the smaller burden, and prove how we can even win then. And I think that even if it proves to you that it's a very small group, we think specifically this group is likely to be very extreme. That is to say that I think even if they're not that big, even as a small group that is actively, for instance, defending themselves, that is actively portraying a group as evil or antagonistic, I think it is still very